For the last Houdini demo, I thought it would be kind of neat to work with a process in Houdini that kind of ties together with the photogrammetry class. We're going to use Houdini to take a high poly photogrammetry model, retopologize it down a little bit lower, and unwrap it automatically and bake onto that lower poly model the vertex color as well as a normal map. We're still going to get a little bit higher poly of an object, so this wouldn't work 100% for the photogrammetry class, but it's a beginning to see how you could use these tools. You'd probably have to go in and clean it up a little bit more, but we're ultimately going to end up with a much nicer mesh on the other side. So let's begin. The first thing we do need to do is import in our high poly model. For this demo, I do have a teapot model from photogrammetry class. If you've taken the class, you'll recognize this teapot right away. If you haven't taken photogrammetry and you plan to do that, you're going to end up seeing this teapot quite a bit. So first things first, we are going to need to go to our object panel, and we're going to create a file node. And I'm going to just rename this one to high because this is ultimately going to be our high poly object in here. So let's go into it just by double clicking, and this file node is going to allow us to choose a high poly object. So I'm going to select it. I'm going to come up here and click this little button, and I'm going to locate my high poly model, which is right here. Let me just double check this one I want to work with. Yes, teapot demo. Okay. Keep in mind this is a really large object. It came out of Reality Capture Super Huge. So we are going to kind of scale it a little bit. So if you don't see it, it's fine to zoom out. And here is our teapot. You can see the vertex colors on it. So we do need to do a little of work on it first. So the first node I'm going to add to this is an attribute delete node because we want to take off a couple of attributes off of here. So I'm just going to right click and search for attribute, delete, and it's this one. The only thing we really want to get off of here is going to be the primitive attributes, this material, shop material path, because we need to put our own material on it. So we are going to do that. Don't delete any other attributes off of here because we're going to need all of them. You can see underneath the point, is it the point or the vertex attribute? Yeah, they have the color information on there underneath the point attribute, and that's what we need, that CD. That's this has vertex color baked into it for its texture. Rather than working with a traditional unwrap with a texture map, this one is done by vertex color. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to make it a little bit more reasonable in size because this is a humongous teapot right now. Stuff out of Reality Capture can come out a little bit big, so we can kind of practice resizing and moving stuff. It is kind of floating above the origin too. So I'm going to find a match size node. And we don't actually need to match any sizes to this. All we need to do is, once we turn it on, you can see that it does move it to the origin. And we also want to check on scale to fit. And it's going to kind of make it a much more reasonable size. So if I hit F to zoom in, that's the F key, it's a lot closer to probably an actual teapot size. So it's going to be a little bit easier to work with. So you can see that nasty surface on there. And this is a typical photogrammetry model, is that they don't really have the best topology. So we're going to come in to this and we are going to clean this up a little bit so that it's a little bit nicer looking, and we're going to cut the polygon count down on it too. So let's first thing we're going to do is trim off this bottom. Most photogrammetry models come in kind of ugly. This one was trimmed a little bit, but we got some of these floating islands, and it's kind of an ugly bottom there. It's really jagged. So we're just going to use a simple clip node to trim off that bottom. So I'm going to come over here, right click, and choose clip. Feed that in, and turn it on. And the way that this is going to work is it just has a clipping plane, and you just have to adjust this a little bit so that the position of the plane is clipping the correct part of the teapot. So by default, it is, right at the origin. So we do want to keep it primitives above the plane, but keep in mind that you can do below the plane. We can change the direction. We can change the origin of this. So if you ever do need to just kind of cut a piece of your geometry off, this is a great way, like a nice slice. So the distance is what we're going to want to mess with. So, up or down. I've kind of done this, so I do know that the correct distance we want to put this plane at is negative 0.27. But do play around with some of these tools so that you understand how to use them. And we can see that we're getting a nice slice off the bottom. I do know it's a little bit kind of crooked. That is just part of the model. This is a simple demo, just kind of getting used to this workflow. So it's okay that it's not perfect. We're not too concerned about that for this. All right, so we got that. Since we are kind of messing around a little bit with the geometry, it is always best to put down a normal node. Hook that in. And last is we're kind of done getting the high poly ready before we turn it into low poly. So we're going to put down a null afterwards and rename this to high render, just so that we know that this is going to be our high poly for when we do our bake. Before we begin our low poly, let's take a look and see how many polygons are actually on here, if you're ever wondering how to set this up, haven't done that already. So on this right side of the viewport, I'm going to go to this eyeball. It's the last icon. I'm going to find the guides tab and this geometry information right here where it's set to off. Let's change it to selection only. And we're going to save that out. That's okay. And notice now that we do have our primitives and points. So it has 532,000 primitives. So this is definitely not ready for a game. So the last thing we do need to do before we work on our low poly is we do need to put a material on this object so that we can eventually bake it out correctly. If you don't do this step, it's not going to work right. So we do need to apply a shader to this. So I'm going to go to my material, and I'm going to click on material palette, and we just need a principled shader. So I'm just going to drag this principled shader, it's the very top one, into here. And we're going to select it, and the thing, we have to make a couple changes. Actually, I think just one change. The base color needs to be white, or else it's going to affect what we bake onto things. So let's just change this to white. And we need to make sure that use point color is turned on. Since we are using point color, that information is baked into our model from reality capture. So I'm just going to drag this on, and we should be good to go. Our high poly is now done, and we can work on the low poly. So I'm going to click back over to the object. Let's go back to here. I just clicked on that tab right there. And let's go inside of our high poly. We're actually going to work with creating our low poly inside of here. And then we're going to do a little bit of stuff to make sure we have two separate objects. But ultimately, we're going to be kind of building that low poly in here and then linking it out to another object in here. Okay, so the first one that we want to work with is this remesh node. So I'm going to right click, type remesh. And this is definitely a node you might want to tweak and play around with to see exactly what it does, but you can see what it looks like right now. I'm going to hook up. Actually, let me before I do this, let me save it first. It's always good to save your stuff. I totally forgot. Um, okay. And now let's hook this up. So I'm going to just drag it from the normal to here. I'm going to click the little button. And the first one's going to be a little bit ugly because it's going to be kind of low. It's going to take a moment, so be patient if it takes a second to pop over to the next one. So here is our low poly teapot. Yeah. Um, not not quite what we need yet, but we can do some tweaks. So the area that we're going to really want to mess with is over here with this target size. And this is going to give us our edge length. So remember, we did shrink that teapot down so that it is a lot smaller, and you can kind of see the length it's trying to do for our um, edges, and that's a little bit too large. So we don't want to go too small. Like if we could go down really small to like a 0.001 edge length and hit enter. And again, be patient. You can see that it's processing down here. So I'm actually going to pause the video while it does this so you don't have to sit here and watch it. So it's going to just jump for you. So we're back, and this is now our model. Let's see if I can, if we zoom in, you can see the mesh. It's a really nice clean mesh. Way too small. There's still way too many polygons for what we need to work with here. So let's let me actually change this, see if this setting will work a little bit better. So it's not showing me my stuff. It's fine. We'll worry about that later. It's way too small. So that 0.001, a little bit too much. 0.1 though, again, this one will go pretty quick. It's a little bit closer. That's probably good enough. We get the essence of the teapot. Again, this, let's see, we're down to 15,000 points, which, or basically 30,000 primitives. That's not bad. Obviously, if this was like a larger model, like if we're thinking like a statue or something bigger, like a hero piece in our game, 30,000 would be reasonable. Something small like a teapot, obviously 30,000 is a little bit much, but look at how nice that mesh came out now. It's a lot better than it was. So that's why I think it's a really nice tool to show. If we're doing larger pieces that can support 30,000 primitives, perfectly fine. Our smaller things, not so much. We'd still need to work on that a little bit more. There are some other tools for resurfacing stuff, but if you have taken the photogrammetry class or ever tried to play around with the retopologize tools in Maya, they're not that great and they're really slow. So even if you're just trying to take meshes, dirty meshes, to retopologize, to do other things with, this might be a good intermediate step. It does a pretty good job. So we're going to consider this our low poly model. The next step is going to be to do an unwrap on here. Again, we're kind of doing things just automatically, like we're kind of pretending that maybe we have just a bunch of photo scanned rocks that we just need to process. So we're just kind of getting them done. We're just getting them through the pipeline. We just need them good enough because we have like 50 of them to do. So this this remesh would probably be okay for something like that. We do need to unwrap it though. If we go to our, let's see, perspective, we can change it to our UV viewport. Our UVs are kind of all over the place, and since we can't rely on vertex color, since we don't have a lot of vertices now, we do need to unwrap and bake onto our texture. So I'm going to use an auto UV node. this Labs Auto UV. Turn it on. And let's see. It does a pretty good job on its own. I wouldn't like if you use this in photogrammetry class where I really kind of focus on um, practicing unwrapping and stuff like that, it wouldn't be good enough for that class. But again, if we're kind of in a hurry, you're processing a large batch of photoscanned objects and you just need to get stuff through, it does an okay job, as you can see. But if you are expected to kind of hand do stuff, like this is a little bit messy. But again, depends on the situation you're in, but please don't, if you take photogrammetry, don't just use this for your unwrap because you need to practice doing it a little bit better. The other node we probably want to put in after auto UV is going to be our UV layout node. It doesn't look like it does too much, but there's one important thing I do want to point out. It did wiggle it a little bit. The one really important node with the UV layout is that we want to make sure that scale islands to match their surface area is checked. This shouldn't be too much of an issue with the way that we did things, but it's always good to double check those things. This will make sure that the textile density is maintained consistently through the whole unwrap, and that's a really important concept for this. All right, let's switch back to our perspective. And yeah, 55% coverage. That's not great. We could do better if we were going to hand do that, but for setting up an automatic pipeline, it's okay. We're going to throw a normal node on it, just because that's what we do, and then we're going to make a another null node so that we can call this high render. I'm sorry, low render. Okay. I'm also going to make sure I put the eyeball on the high one. That's important because this is ultimately the high poly, but we're going to link this low render one out separately. So before I go out, I do need to get a little bit of information. I need to get the path of this node, and I can do that by clicking the I, like the letter I, not the I, not this one, this information node right here. And it's going to pull this up, this little information. And what I'm going to do is this right here. This is the path of my low poly. And I'm going to need this outside of this model. So I'm going to just highlight this and hit Control C on my keyboard to copy this. I'm then going to go up to my object level and I'm going to, this is that high. I'm going to right click and put down a new geometry node right here called low. So what we need to do is we do need to put our low poly kind of in here. We're not going to actually move anything over. I'm going to double click to go inside, and I'm going to add an object merge node. And up here underneath object 1, all we need to do is, remember how I control C that path for my low poly? I'm just going to control V, paste that in. But one thing is really important. It kind of kept this weird, I think this is a paragraph symbol. That's going to mess things up. So we do need to come back in and, oops, delete that out. Hit enter. And now we have our low poly model inside of here. So if I jump back up to the object level, we have the low poly, we have the high poly, and you can see how nicely they fit. So we are ready to bake now. We need to bake that vertex color information onto the texture of the low poly, and we can go ahead and do a normal map too. Might as well. We usually do those. So to do this, we need to go to our out area, and we can do that either by going to out on the left, or we could come up here and click up here, and we were in object, we could jump to the out. And we need to set up our baker for this. So let me just right click and do a bake texture. It's this one, and drop it on. So there are some really fiddly settings we need to set here. So make sure that you are kind of watching carefully and not missing one of these settings, or else it's not going to work correctly. So the first thing, if you want to change the resolution, we can change that here. And then we need to tell it what our high and low objects are. So the UV object 1, this is our low poly. This is the object that we have our UV unwrap on. The high poly is not unwrapped. So we're going to click here to find that low. So do you see it's named low? It's easy to find. We're going to accept that. We now need to tell it what our high res object is. So I'm going to click here, do our high, accept that. We then need to tell it where we're going to bake our stuff out to. So this output picture 1. They refer to the textures as pictures, so if you see that stuff, kind of weird, but it's fine. So I'm going to click here. I am going to locate where I want to drop this into. I'm going to do it into my demo folder. Just call it teapot texture. That's good enough. Hit accept. A couple other settings. Down here, we want to make sure that we have extract image planes set. I'm going to extract it to a targa. I like targas myself, but you could change the format if you wanted to. I'm just going to stick with targas. What we want to bake out, we want to bake out the tangent space normal. And we want to bake out, and this is the important one, it's the surface unlit base color, this one right here. And that's what's going to bake out our vertex color. Let's go over to the baking tab now. So that was images. Let's go to baking. You need to make sure that underneath the baking tab, you check include displacement, tangent normals face forward. If you don't click this, you're going to have your normal map's going to come out looking yellow or like a really weird color. So you need to make sure that you check that on. The other area we need to go under is this advanced tab right here. So we're going to go here and we're going to go to the driver tab right here. And what we want to change is this copy alpha to planes. We actually need to just delete out what's in here. Otherwise, we're going to get a really bad looking albedo coming out of here. We don't want the alpha stuff on our planes. We don't need that. It looks really poor. Okay, I think we are ready to bake. And I can have my, I'm going to make sure I have my folder ready to go. When you are ready to bake, all you need to do is click this render to disk button right here. Actually, let me save it first. And it honestly doesn't take too long. It doesn't take too long to bake. It does a pretty good job. So I'm going to click render to disk. Don't worry about that. We're not too concerned about that. And I'm going to make sure I have my folder. And we got our first thing, and that's fine. That's just kind of a garbage thing. We don't need to worry about that. And there's our other ones. We have, this one doesn't seem to have anything in it. Usually it's really small, but we have our base color and our NT, which is our normal. So I'm going to open up Photoshop so we can take a look at those. I'm just going to drag them into my Photoshop. And here it is. We have our our vertex colors baked on. The one thing I'm not too certain about, and it's something I'm kind of exploring, is I don't like how it shouldn't be this light. It looks like it's getting lighting information on there. And I need to kind of play around with it a little bit to figure out how to stop that. For now, for just practicing, it's fine. This is the basics of it. It's probably some checkbox somewhere I need to click. But this is a really good place to start as far as working with this kind of process. And if we go look at our normal map, we have our normal map baked down onto it. It is a little bit noisy of a high poly, so that's fine. This is just a really good practice one to work with. But yeah, we're done. We would be able to then export out our low poly model, and we could take this into another, like a game or something like that, and have a nice looking teapot.